Tracian Prime's market quarter smelled of hot copper and rain, the kind of odor that makes the sky feel like a factory, and through its steam-veiled alleys drifted a child who had learned to step as if she were already sorry. The alien merchants saw her coming the way animals feel a storm, shuddering stalls with the crisp choreography of people who prefer guilt to contact, pushing baskets of day-old bread under tables rather than into her hands. She was thin in the way numbers are thin, all sharp angles beneath a cloak that had never been new. Skin translucent enough to show the old bruises like a map of places she had been denied. The burnt Xanthari sigils along her collarbone half-healed and wholly damning. When she reached for a crust, a six-limbed grocer shifted his cart as if to block a contagion, muttering the phrase that civilizations use when they want cruelty to sound like hygiene. Not for her kind. And the people nearby practiced looking away as if it were a civic duty. Corin Miles watched this from the edge of the square. A human soldier whose armor had been scoured by wars the posters had already forgotten, and something in him that had survived artillery and tribunals but never learned to accept indifference, folded its arms and refused to move. He crossed the street without asking permission from the architecture, knelt so his silhouette wouldn't loom like a charge, and set his ration pack on the cracked stone between them as if it were an altar that could be trusted to keep its promises. Up close, she looked smaller and older at once, the way hunger cheats time. Her hands hovered over the food in a tremble that felt less like fear than like an argument with her own doubt. Corin broke the bar in half with deliberate slowness, so she could see there was no trick, placed one half in her palm, and set the other on his knee where she could watch him eat it first. An ancient ritual learned in places where trust is too expensive to buy retail. A security drone swiveled to watch with the prim disapproval of a bureaucrat in the sky. Merchants hissed about fines and biohazards, and still he unfastened the neck seal of his jacket and draped it around her shoulders because the rain had turned greedy and small bones lose arguments with weather. The girl flinched at the weight of the fabric, then drew it tighter until the collar touched her chin, eyes flicking to the edges of the square as if checking which door the kindness planned to escape through. "You hungry?" he asked, the question as unnecessary as a sunrise, and just as important. And he kept his hand open on the ground, not because she might take it, but because she might need to see it not closing. Above them, the council tower brightened as the evening systems came on, making sanctimony look like daylight. But on the pavement level, a less photogenic miracle announced itself in the simplest grammar available to a species with a future. A man and a starving child. And food. He didn't ask her story because he had met too many stories already. He offered water and the chance to sit without being shooed. And he let the square do what squares do when someone interrupts their script. They watched. A street sweeper paused and pretended to adjust a bristle that did not need adjusting. A courier slowed as if his satchel had grown heavier with mail that wasn't urgent. A trio of schoolchildren peered around a pillar, their curiosity trying on bravery for size. Corin pretended not to notice the audience because turning a meal into a performance is a violence of its own, and because the child's breath, shallow and counting, required all the attention in the vicinity. He set the protein square closer, palms up, and when she finally reached, he kept his eyes not on her face but on the ground between them, giving her privacy in public, which is a kind of dignity rarer than coins. The rain thickened, the lights came up, and the city waited to see whether it was still the kind of place where a simple thing could be allowed to happen without being interrupted by law. She lifted the food with the ceremonial awkwardness of someone who has been punished for doing it wrong, claws tapping the foil like a nervous drummer, and then slid the smallest corner past her teeth, as if expecting the taste to accuse her. When it did not, when the salt and fat reported only nourishment, her eyes went briefly too wide for her skull and then filled, spilling careful tracks through the soot. Corin kept chewing his half with the unhurried focus of a man demonstrating a safe passage, and only when she took a second, larger bite did he lower his voice into the register that doesn't startle birds or children. "What should I call you?" he asked, not demanding a deed to her past, just seeking a handle the present could hold. And after a long, static, scraped pause, she found the syllables and offered them like contraband. Veli. He nodded as if she had just told him the name of a star he had been navigating by for years without knowing, said it back once to put it on the map, and then said, "Good," in the tone medics use when a pulse decides to be reasonable. Somewhere above, a patrol siren rehearsed its importance, but on the ground, the only authority that mattered was the rhythm of small bites taken and swallowed without flinching. Rain began to needle through the market's annex roofs, so he shifted closer to the lee of a shutter and, without asking, pulled the jacket tighter around her collar, because choice should never have to wrestle precipitation. She watched his hands as if they might suddenly turn back into something the city recognized. Grasping, pushing, denying. And when they did not, when they only did the dull work of warmth, her shoulders let go the fraction that hope demands before it will sit down. He offered water and tilted the canteen so she could drink without exposing her throat to the crowd, and when the metal sang a high, glassy note against her teeth, he made a pleased face, as if she had performed a party trick rather than evidence of a life spent arguing with cold. A merchant jeered from a stall that no longer had the courage to stay open, listing regulations as if compassion were a zoning violation, and Corin answered not with policy but with posture. He turned so his back absorbed the remarks and the wind both, letting her finish the bar in the weather shadow of a human decision. Slow, he reminded, when hunger tried to make up for its lost weeks in 1 minute, and she obeyed, not because he was a soldier, but because the word had arrived in the plain packaging of care. When the last crumb was gone, she made the universal motion of people who have been trained to leave no evidence, a quick swipe across the ground to push away proof. Then stopped, caught between old law and the new one he was writing with his body. "It's yours," he said, an absurd sentence and the only one that fit, and then because the square had ears he added, "And so is the jacket until you're warm of your own accord." The security drone dipped for a better angle and a better scold, and he stared it down with the weary authority of someone who had earned the right to be unafraid of cameras. It blinked, reclassified the scene as low threat, and climbed, embarrassed. Veli shifted until her shoulder found his knee, a cautious lean like a truce flag testing the wind. And when the sky broke fully open and poured, she did not run. She tucked closer, made a small, surprised sound that might one day be a laugh, and watched the rain turn the square into a different city. Corin, who had seen planets renamed by artillery and treaties, let himself memorize this quieter renaming. The moment a child decides a bench with a man on it is a place, and he understood with embarrassing clarity that the rest of his evening, and very likely his life, had been scheduled on his behalf by a bite of food. The rumor moved faster than rain, sprinting up service ladders and into the earpieces of men who prefer rules to judgment, so that by the time Corin walked Veli to the transit concourse, the barriers were already sliding into place, as if the city had decided to practice siege on a single child. A triad of patrol officers in lacquered blue stood under the hologram of the council's seal, and spoke with the kind of clipped certainty that can only be issued to people who will never meet those they legislate. They called her a biohazard and him an accessory, and a drone above their heads helpfully translated compassion into administrative misconduct. Corin placed his palm against the turnstile, so the machine would have to argue with a body rather than a policy, angled his shoulder so Veli fit behind his hip like a fact a bureaucracy hadn't learned to read, and said, not loudly but in the grammar of men whose lungs have practiced under fire, that she would not be processed. The tallest officer smiled without moving his eyes and cited ordinance numbers, the way a man recites invocations to a god who has stopped listening. Behind them, a medic in gray glanced at the girl and then at her own kit, as if trying to remember whether she had been trained for any scenario that suggested mercy. When the rifle muzzles tilted like accusatory commas, Corin's left hand dropped to the pouch on his thigh and lifted a flash device he hadn't used since a boarding action that still visited his sleep. He didn't threaten with it because threats are gossip. He simply thumbed it alive and counted. Light detonated in the concourse with a white that turned the world into an X-ray of regret. And while Reflex bent every head, he lifted Vayli as if gravity were on his side for once, tucked her under the curtain of his jacket, and moved. They ran the way soldiers teach children to run, low, with their decisions already made, their hands busy with only what must be carried. And the city, surprised to find itself useful to fugitives, offered shortcuts it had forgotten it owned. A maintenance hatch took them into the throat of a ventilation artery that smelled of old rain and antiseptic. A rusted catwalk carried them over a canal where broken neon crawled like wounded snakes. A stairwell that had never been swept became a ladder into a neighborhood that did not ask questions because it had learned not to ask for answers. The first pursuit drone recovered its vision and came whining after them with the zeal of a convert. Corin let it draw close, waited for the sweep of its sensor to blind itself against a puddle's reflection, and palmed it into a wall with the professional tenderness of a man sending an old comrade to sleep. At the freight elevator that served the abandoned memorial level, 2 private security men tried to earn hazard pay by blocking the doors with their posture. Corin gave them the insignia of the unit he had bled for, no longer official, still a language, and said, "Not today," and the younger of the 2 stepped aside because some uniforms haven't forgotten what they were for. Vayli did not cry, which worried him more than if she had. She simply counted his breaths with her fingers on his jacket seam and matched them, as if syncing to his metronome could edit the scene into something survivable. They reached the old war monument at last, a stone colonnade where pigeons had won the peace, and slipped behind the statue of a general whose name even the plaques had given up on remembering. Corin had slept here once during a blackout, and muscle memory led him to the service door that never latched. Inside, the air smelled of carbon and dust, and the human salt of men who had hidden here with better reasons and worse luck. He set Vayli down on a crate, knees aching with a complaint he would address when there was time, and listened in circles until the pursuing footsteps fell out of the pattern that means proximity and into the one that means bureaucracy rewriting its plan. The adrenaline left his body like a caravan negotiating a mountain. Slowly, with negotiations, and in the quiet afterward his heart wrote rage notes he didn't intend to perform. About a city that could inventory hunger as risk, about a tower that radiated decency and burned bread, about the sheer incompetence of a species that can cross stars and still need to be reminded to feed a child. Vayli reached for his sleeve, looked surprised to find it still there, then made the smallest concession a survivor can make to a future. She leaned her forehead against his forearm and let it rest there, as if borrowing from a ledger she planned to repay. "Still hungry?" he asked. Not because he didn't know, but because normal questions are scaffolds. She nodded, and the nod broke his anger into something he knew how to spend. The bunker beneath the monument was a museum of half-finished good intentions. A field stove with its hose coiled like a sleeping serpent, a rack of dented mess tins, a crate of emergency blankets whose seals had been broken and retaped by men who thought they might need them later and then didn't live to. Corin took inventory with the calm of a man who has learned to trust nouns, pot, water, heat, salt, because adjectives don't boil. He coaxed the stove into cooperation with a judicious kick, and a curse taught to him by a sergeant who swore in 4 languages and loved all of them. He filled the pot from a valve that wheezed like an old smoker and cracked a ration brick into it with the reverence due to any object about to be transformed into kindness. Steam climbed, suspicious at first, then approving, and soon the bunker smelled like broth and pepper and the faint metallic nostalgia of recycled air pretending to be domestic. Vayli watched from the crate, wrapped to the chin in his jacket, eyes flicking between flame and door, and his hands, like a pilot triangulating a landing she isn't entirely convinced the runway deserves. And when he offered the tin, she took it with a startle that softened into hunger's honesty. He did not make her talk. He narrated the work, because work is a lullaby that does not ask for anything it cannot deliver. "We'll need to seal that draft before night," he said, pointing with his chin at the seam under the door where the wind practiced burglary. "When the pot rattles like that, the water's bossy, and you turn it down, he observed when the lid jittered. Soup is just water, persuaded to carry more than it wants, he explained, because metaphors can hold a room together when policy breaks it. She ate without looking away, as if the spoon were a secret that might vanish if she blinked, and when the heat licked too high and she flinched, he did not scold. He blew across the surface and handed it back as if the act had been for him all along. After the second portion, she tested the perimeter of the jacket like a cat deciding whether a lap has a lease. After the third, she set the tin down and stared at the ceiling with a frown so careful he recognized it as the blueprint of a question. "I don't understand why," she said at last, the words skittering through a throat trained to be useful only for breath, and he answered with the least performative sentence in his repertoire. "Because someone should have done it earlier," he said. "Because I am here. Because you are." They worked after they ate because bodies sleep better when they have proof they will be allowed to wake in the same place. He sealed the draft with adhesive and a strip of thermal fabric. She held the edge with steadying claws while the glue set, tongue between her teeth in a concentration so pure the room stood still to watch. He showed her how to roll a blanket into a sausage and tuck it into the crook of her knees so heat would learn a shorter route. She imitated the motion with a flourish that would have earned applause in a gentler theater. He unsnapped the plates of his chest armor and propped them by the entrance at an angle that told any returning footstep it was being observed. She arranged 3 mess tins on the opposite wall like bells and threaded a wire through their handles so they would announce intruders with a music that would put the lie to their intent. When the stove coughed and tried to sulk, she tapped it with a knuckle, in time with the little chime she had coaxed from the canteen earlier, and the flame remembered itself. When the bunker light flickered, he banged the casing the way men do when the world forgets it owes them electricity, and the filament complied from sheer habit. The first night inside was shaped like a test, administered by a biased teacher. Wind licked at the monument's steps and found the door unimpressed. A patrol paused on the concourse above, boots writing reports in dust, and then passed because predators prefer straight lines, and this refuge sat at a kind angle to the city's grid. Valey fell asleep in the narrow bed he had assembled from blankets and stubbornness, then woke hard from a dream that stank of sirens and rooftops. He didn't say it's over because it wasn't. Didn't say you're safe because safety is a currency to be earned and spent hourly. He said drink, and held the tin while her hands found their jobs again. Later, when the temperature decided to remind bones of their debts, he climbed onto the floor beside the pallet without ceremony and let his shoulder serve as furniture. She slid against him with that delicate boldness children risk only when their instincts can afford to be wrong, and slept. Somewhere between her third and fourth slow breaths, the city's nocturnal economy of alarms and promises faded into a background achievable even in war. The pot settling, the blankets thinking better of crinkling, the quiet applause pipes make when they've been persuaded not to burst. Morning auditioned itself with a drizzle that made the monument's stone look honest, and the bunker installed itself into the day like a part of the building that had always existed. Corin shaved with a knife that had decided to be polite, repacked his kit, and wrote a list on the wall in charcoal, because lists are portable courage. Water, bread, bandage, wire, later. Viley, who had learned thrift the way others learn grammar, ate slowly and then put half aside in a small act of rebellion against scarcity, labeling it with her finger on the tin's rim as if to teach absence a lesson about ownership. At the door, he paused because rituals maintain places even when places pretend to maintain themselves. He pressed his palm to the latch, listened to the plaza above for the kind of silence that means a trap, and said over his shoulder the 2 words that had gotten him through worse mornings than this. Back soon. She nodded, but before he could pull the door, she touched his sleeve, frowned as if measuring sentences for fit, and tried his name on the air like a garment. Corin, she said, a sound both careful and sure, and he felt the bunker learn a new purpose around it, as if rooms, like people, are improved by being called to order gently. He returned before noon with contraband and a grin he didn't bother to hide. A coil of copper wire, liberated from a storage cage whose lock had begged to be picked. A pair of boots, a size too big that could be argued into fitting. A paper-wrapped bundle from a stall that had feigned piety yesterday and sold him bread today, because commerce has fewer convictions than compassion. They ate on the floor, because floors are honest, and as they did, he noticed the way her eyes tracked the door. Not with fear now, but with the tactical attention of a sentry already invented. He put a mark beside the word later to honor the new division of labor. When the afternoon fell slantwise and the monument cast its listless shadow down the steps like an old dog, a child and a soldier sat under it and rehearsed a future without dignitaries. One taught spoons to make sense. The other taught wire to sing when disturbed. Both learned the practice of holding still so a world built for spectacle might overlook them long enough to let ordinary happiness do its quiet work. And when the city's lights climbed on like a lie that means to be useful, two people who had never been listed anywhere that mattered added themselves to a different registry by repetition. Eat, breathe, fix, sleep, wake, repeat, until ritual turned into home. The letter arrived on a courier's drone with the posture of a verdict, its seal blister red against cheap paper, declaring Corin Miles subject to censure and the girl designated property of the council's biohazard annex. He pinned the warning to the bunker wall beside Vayli's newest sketch, a lopsided constellation labeled Home, and read it aloud once with the careful contempt reserved for pronouncements that imagine themselves inevitable. "They talk like storms," he said, folding the paper into a square and tucking it under the kettle as if bureaucracy should at least be useful for insulation. Vayli, still wrapped in his jacket, traced the edge of the square with one claw and nodded like a commander, granting weather permission to pass. He trained her between bowls of soup and repairs. Not to break but to choose, teaching the mechanics of stance, the arithmetic of breath, the difference between cover and hiding, and the rare human art of leaving anger outside the door. At dusk, when the city set out its shining decency like a tablecloth, he climbed the monument steps and keyed an ancient distress beacon that had once called ships to battles and now had the audacity to summon witnesses to a kitchen. "She's under my protection," the signal said in old code and older grammar, and all over Tracian Prime the seasoned and the curious glanced up from their habitual indifference and listened. They tested his resolve before midnight with soft boots and hard faces. 3 council agents in rain-shedding cloaks, a pulse of hostile patience in their gait, a crate stenciled with symbols that lie about mercy. Corin didn't answer their knocks so much as take them away, opening the door at an angle that turned the threshold into his ally. Behind him, bells on wire thrummed twice, and Vayli's eyes moved to the hinge the way a sentry checks a gate. "Relinquish the specimen," the lead agent said, as if words could confiscate a child, and Corin gave him the kind of smile men wear when bone-deep fatigue masquerades as courtesy. He did not reach for a weapon, only stepped half a pace, so the man had to address him instead of the girl. When the agent tried to shoulder by, Corin's hand was there first, not striking, simply occupying the space where harm intended to stand, and in that small recalibration, the room discovered a law it hadn't known it obeyed. The person who cooks is in charge. The second agent flicked his wrist to deploy a net. Vayli lifted her palm, breathed the way she had been taught, and asked the air to be sticky in the empty doorway instead of on anyone's skin. The net sighed into uselessness against a frame where nobody stood, and the agent, now tangled in his own assurance, had to choose between dignity and not falling over. He chose clumsy survival, which is how conversions begin. They tried tactics next. Words meant to turn hunger into evidence of guilt, credentials meant to make furniture forget it was furniture, and the bunker answered with nouns. Bells sang when they tugged the wire, the kettle hissed its vote for patience, the blankets softened the edges of voices until even accusations were forced to behave as inside talk. Corin read the room as an old officer reads a map and deployed the only strategy that always works. Details. "She sleeps," he said, counting on his fingers. "She eats without stealing. She knows the door chime. She whistles back to the kettle when it sulks. She can read her name when I write it large and ugly." He showed them the list chalked on the wall. Water, bread, bandage, wire, later. and the agent's eyes flicked down, then up, then away, because lists undermine speeches by having been true all day without announcement. When they finally stepped back into the rain, it felt less like retreat than like the first draft of a rule that would look good on paper tomorrow. The crate went with them unopened, and the city, attentive as a cat, stored the moment in the place it keeps instructions for how to behave better when watched. The next morning began with the awkward miracle of allies. 2 stallkeepers from the market arrived with a sack of bruised fruit that commerce couldn't sell and affection couldn't ignore. A welder from the south hangar carried hinges and refused payment except in stories. The medic who had once only observed now brought vaccine patches and laughter pitched at a child's height. Vayli, startled by abundance, inventoried gifts with the solemnity of a quartermaster, and then broke the smallest pair into 2 equal pieces with mathematical precision, handing Corin the larger half because she had learned the currency of meals. He signed the guardianship petition with a pen that leaked and certainty that didn't, scrawling his name as if the letters could be load-bearing, then printed Ellie beneath it, so large the world would have to read it without squinting. "They'll come back," he said, testing the latch and the bells, the wire and the words, and the girl, who had eaten slowly and believed him quickly, answered with the faith that begins in the stomach and spreads outward until it resembles law. "We will, too." They returned the way weather does, first as rumor, then as pressure, then all at once. An armored column at the foot of the monument steps with the warden himself in a coat that thought it was a verdict. He recited statutes in a cadence that had probably impressed rooms without kitchens, gestured toward a portable stasis unit that made a tasteful hum, and offered the compromise men call humane when they mean tidy. Corin let him finish because interruptions are for cowards. Then he held up the logbook that smelled faintly of broth and smoke and read from it as if it were scripture. 23 nights without incident, 5 neighbors who learned the blanket rule and laughed despite themselves, 1 hinge that squeaks less since Tuesday, 2 bowls a day, 1 child who has stopped saving half her food because she trusts morning to find her alive. Vayli stood next to him wearing boots a size too big that had been argued into obedience, a jacket that no longer sagged like defeat, and the careful posture of someone who has discovered her bones are welcome where they are. "Demonstrate control," the warden said, confident in the emptiness of his demand, and Corin obliged with the only demonstration worth considering: bedtime, a word spoken without threat. The girl signed good night into the bells, banked the fire, set the spoon where tomorrow would remember it, and sat on the pallet with the ordinary grace of people who expect to be there in the morning. Emergency, sensing it was about to be demoted by domesticity, flared along the south wall in a slap of flame from a cracked fuel line, tried to make the case for drama, and lost. Corin barked assignments with the unfussy confidence of a man who remembers where competence lives. Valve, hose, door, and 3 pairs of hands moved as if rehearsed. Vayli pinched the line with cloth-wrapped claws until it stopped misbehaving. The welder leaned into the patch with his weight and a curse. The medic played water like an instrument. The warden's men, who had come prepared to swagger, found themselves passing buckets because the alternative would have made them ridiculous, and nothing reforms posture faster than usefulness. When the hiss softened to apology and the heat decided to belong only in the kettle, the doorway chime gave Sarah's borrowed note, "Honest, not pretty," and the bunker exhaled a breath it had been saving for a bad hour. The warden stared at the shut stasis unit like a man who has brought an umbrella to a planet that loves wind. Then, for the first honest time that day, he smiled, a small embarrassed thing that made his coat look less sure of itself. He signed the permit extension on Corin's leaking pen and smudged ink on his sleeve. The mark suited him. The market changed its manners after that in the way cities do when they discover they've been narrating themselves incorrectly. The 6-limbed grocer pretended he had always set aside the best crust for the girl, and began to do so until the pretense graduated to practice. The courier practiced walking slower past the monument and then forgot to speed up. The street sweeper adjusted a bristle that still didn't need adjusting and left it crooked because the doorway chimed more pleasantly that way. Veli ate without counting the door every time, then learned to count for others, portioning bowls at the sanctuary that grew like moss around the bunker, thin, persistent, beautiful to those who know where to look. Corin watched her teach a smaller child to hold a spoon like a promise, and felt the ache in his chest that combat surgeons can't diagnose and poets won't shut up about. He put it to work, which is to say he built another rail, mended another latch, wrote another list. In the evenings he told stories that had learned to be true without being proud, about engines that forgave, about ships that limped home, about people who chose to be furniture when rooms needed it. And when he ran out of stories, he named the items on the shelf aloud, until his voice found the quiet it had earned. They did not win a revolution. They enforced a routine that refused to fail. Agents still came sometimes with faces that had practiced being unpersuadable, and the blanket rule still turned their dignity inside out until it looked like humor. Forms still arrived with lines for numbers where names belonged, and the pen still leaked in a way that stained fingers like a vow. But the city's memory improved, and that is the only miracle that ever sticks. The square where a jacket became law. The concourse where light made room for a decision. The monument that traded speeches for soup. On the morning the last warning expired without effect, Corin tacked the card to the inside of the door. Guardian of record, his name below it in letters that could carry weight. And Violet tapped the paper twice, an old superstition she had invented to make documents behave. "Still hungry?" he asked, out of habit and love, and she shook her head, then pointed past him. There, at the steps, where two newcomers hovered with the rigid shoulders of people who have learned the wrong lessons about asking. He stepped aside, not as surrender but as invitation, and the room performed the ceremony it had been refining since the night in the market. Weapons peg, blanket for 3 breaths, chime that says you may be seen and not measured, kettle that doesn't care what tribe you claim, so long as you lean your hunger into its steam. Veli set bowls on the rail she and Corin had straightened yesterday. The newcomers practiced the arithmetic of bites. The wind tried the latch once and decided against it. The warden's coat passed in the street outside, less certain of its job each day and more comfortable for it. The medic taught a child to knot a bandage without looking at her hands. The welder listened to the chime and declared the hinge would last another winter with only minimal flattery. Corin wiped his leaking pen on his sleeve, which now carried more signatures than stains, and wrote the day's list on the wall where memory can see it. Water, bread, bandage, wire, later. Always later, never never. When night came, it found the monument busy with small verbs, and a soldier who had once been hired to break things, holding the kind of line the galaxy rarely honors and never forgets. A door, open on purpose.